Hey you guys, it's Professor Vitt, and we are going to walk through the course framework right now. I've included a PDF for you guys to go over as you watch this video. I think it'll be helpful to kind of keep things in line. This is just to give you some idea how all of this is supposed to go, how the whole course is supposed to work, at least in theory. There are parts that we won't get into here, but I just want to give you some start, some sense of what the vision is for the class, right? It's kind of like this represents a roadmap for us, and what we'll be learning and how we're kind of going to get through stuff. So you can see at the top, this is the course framework, critical thinking framework. And I encourage you guys just to follow along with this as we go through the presentation. I just included it as a PDF for you guys. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get cranking on this. Okay, so we're going to run through the course framework. We're going to talk about many of these icons. We're not going to talk about this one here. I'll mention it in passing. This is one of the alternatives that we'll be covering, which are perceptual errors or memory errors, errors that occur as a result of our faulty wiring or our kind of incomplete funny nervous system. So let's start off with the very first thing in the course framework, the claim, right? What is it that someone is stating? Now, I'm going to choose an example here from that's actually very famous, but you've probably not heard of before. Angelo Fantaccioni, or Fantaccioni. It might be Fantaccioni, I don't know. If you speak Italian and you know how that's pronounced, I would be absolutely ecstatic if you would let me know. I'd be so happy, I'd float. Okay, that joke will be funny in a second. Angelo Fantaccioni, who lived in the earlier part of the 20th century and some of the 19th, I think, he had a special superpower. He could remain buoyant like a cork, just bobbing in water. He was a normal person, it looked like, but for some reason he had this miraculous ability. So this is a picture of him here reading a paper. Notice that some of the paper's wet, but not all of it, right? That there's parts that are dry. So the idea here, here's when he was born, 1859 to 1931. He was an Italian-American who discovered during his childhood, I don't know how you would find this out, that he could float for long periods of time, probably when he jumped in the water. Now, his professional feats include being sewn into a sack, thrown into a river, and attached to a 20-pound cannonball. He poked his head out of the sack soon, still chained to the cannonball, and he remained motionless in that position for hours. This is another picture of him here, just floating. And apparently he could do this, even with tremendous weights, keeping him down, he could still float. He was absolutely the rage of his day. And you can see here a little comic book or cartoon adaptation of him from when comic books were super popular. And the idea was, hey, there's this actual account of a guy out here who can float in water, and believe it or not, this is actually true. Now, it appears to be correct. We have some contemporaneous accounts of him, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Why this is a mystery is that Angelo died without telling anybody how he did this. So it's very strange, right? We may never know, but contemporary scientists couldn't find any illusion. So a lot of people assumed it was because he was doing something with another world, right? That he was somehow very spiritual or accessed some kind of reality. I mean, who knows, right? They just knew that he was doing this. They weren't sure how he was doing this. At the time, people thought that spirits would assist him and keep him floating. He promised to reveal the secret of his buoyancy, but he never did. He died on August the 2nd of 1931. Okay, so what do we want to do with this case is explain the course framework in terms of it. So the first question, right, that we answered was, what's the claim, right? What is it that I'm saying when I tell you this story? Well, I'm saying that there was a guy who had some kind of paranormal superpower, which means he was operating somehow outside of the laws of the known universe. It looked like in absolute opposition to everything we knew, he had the superpower. The superpower was floating, but hey, it's still a superpower, right? So it still counts. Okay. Now, he dies with the secret untold. So that we want to know, is this an extraordinary claim? The idea that Angelo Fettuccone was capable of floating in water. Okay, well, what makes a claim extraordinary, right? Okay, a claim is extraordinary if it's rare or improbable. That would be this. I only know of one person who would be capable of performing these feats, and that would be Angelo himself. Is it anomalous? That's very similar to just saying, is it unusual? Is it a rarity? Is it a singularity? Is it something we haven't seen before? Is it contrary to nature? Yeah, someone floating like that is, particularly when they're attached to extremely heavy weights. The idea is that eventually, if Fettuccone couldn't float, he would have been too tired to stay afloat. And yet we have records of him staying afloat for like 15 hours without swimming. And is it contrary to our everyday experience? Yes, it is, right? It's unusual for people to be able to float like that. People are not normally so buoyant. So the extent to which we're concerned with identifying this claim as extraordinary depends on what we already know. And we know people are not normally so buoyant. Now, sure, they're made of, more than 70% water, but still, that in itself doesn't make you float. That's why people do drown. So, is it extraordinary? Yes, 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 and yes. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you have an extraordinary claim, you've got to give it extraordinary evidence, right? So, if it's like a scale. If my claim is extraordinary, then the evidence for it has to be extraordinary. If I told you that I flew to school every day, and what I meant by that was I literally flapped my hands and I started here in Rancho Cucamonga and I flew all the way to Long Beach just by using my hands, you would not believe me. You would say, that's probably false, you're lying. I would need to see it to believe it, right? But suppose I gave you a picture, right, of me doing it. You might not believe the picture because the idea is I could fake the picture. Now suppose I take your closest friends, right, 6 or 7 very close friends of yours, and I demonstrate to all of them that I can fly like that. Then all 6 or 7 of those people come to you and say, you're just not going to believe this. Professor Vitt can actually do it. I've never seen anyone do anything like this. It's amazing. You probably still wouldn't believe it. You would detect maybe that I was committing fraud, right? That I was tricking everybody. Maybe I'd paid everybody off to lie. The idea is because my claim is so crazy, you need some crazy evidence to prove it. You might want to actually watch me perform the feat. And even then you might not believe it. You'd say, well, I want to watch you do it, but I want to watch other people inspect you. Scientists, magicians, people like that who could actually tell me whether or not you're committing a fraud that I can't detect. So the notion of this principle is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I'm going to often call it ECREE, and that's just an abbreviation for this. ECREE. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, so what kind of evidence do we have for this? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit later about this stuff about whether or not the evidence is open to inspection, but essentially the kinds of evidence that we have for this are anecdotes. And anecdotes, remember from the Bigfoot break and also just in general in the course, anecdotes are stories, right? Now, we do have some documents, we do have some contemporaneous documents and some eyewitness reports of people who said he could do this. Do we have any documentary evidence? We do have some photos of him floating. We don't have any videos or films or anything, to my knowledge anyway. We don't have any remaining physical evidence that this happened. Remember, this was almost 100 years ago now. That's pretty tough, right? You're not gonna be much physical evidence around of him floating. I mean, maybe the pool, but even then, that wouldn't do you any good. So, we're in a tight spot here. Although we have reports of people who saw him do this, and we have pictures of him doing this, we don't actually have the ability to inspect it ourselves. So the evidence isn't open to inspection. Okay, so it would be like one of your friends telling you, oh, Professor Vitt can fly, right? Well, we have a story of it, but you don't actually have the ability to look at it for yourself. So the crazier the claim, the better the evidence that we're going to demand for the claim. And that's because it conflicts with stuff that we already know is true, right? Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about with regard to the evidence. On another occasion, Angelo swam across the Hudson River tied to a chair which was weighted with lead. Doctors at Harvard University, yes, Harvard, tested Mr. Fatticione's abilities by observing him in a pool of water with a 20-pound lead weight tied to him. Fatticcione stayed afloat for 15 hours. So in other words, he obviously would have been tired if he was swimming, right? Nobody could maintain that for that long, or at least in very rare circumstances. Doctors concluded that Fatticcione's abilities were due to abnormal internal organs. Now, if we had Fatticcione alive today, we could put him in a pool and inspect him for ourselves. But we are not able to. So although we have evidence, that evidence isn't really open to inspection. We know it was at one time. We know that at one time scientists looked and tried to determine how he was doing this, but unfortunately we don't have access to that stuff now. You may say, well, big deal, it's still the scientists, you know, they're pretty smart. Look, scientists are people, just like you and me, and they don't have a magical wand that guarantees truth. They are just as susceptible to being deceived or defrauded or hoaxed as any one of us. So we don't know a ton about the conditions under which he was investigated, but we know that he was, so we don't have any evidence that is open to inspection. But we have reports of people who were investigating the claim. Okay, before we lead to our conclusion, before we say, okay, is this claim likely to be true, or should we accept this claim? I want to talk about two principles in our flow, in our little workflow. One of them is called the reductio. And the reductio is a way of thinking. It's a style of argument that basically goes like this. And I'll explain the pig in a second. The reductio says, if this claim is true, what must logically follow as a result? So if it's true that Fatticcione was floating, if it's true that he had this supernatural power, what else would have to be true? Well, suppose some people thought he did it by magic, literally magic, you know, like a wand, right? Harry Potter up in here. If it's magic, then presumably Fatticcione didn't create this magic. He probably got it from someone else, right? If he was able to make himself float, probably we would have records in history of someone else doing this. It's such an extraordinary thing. It would be very remarkable to have someone just... it would be very remarkable if this was a real magic spell, that we wouldn't have evidence of somebody else using this spell, right? If Fatticcione just had weird anatomy, right, or an odd physiology, meaning his organs, like the doctors at Harvard said, if something about his anatomy allowed him to do this, then we might expect, it's not necessarily the case, but we might expect other examples of people being able to do this, right? People have DNA. People are very different, but they're not so different that somebody's going to have a totally different organ in their heart, right? Or organ in their body. Someone's going to say, oh, I don't actually have a heart, right? Instead, I have a, whatever, you know, a bob. And it doesn't work like a heart, but it still helps me get going. No, I mean, this would be absurd, right? People tend to have the same kinds of physiology, generally speaking. So if it was just a question of his odd physiology, maybe somebody else in his family might have this trait, right? Maybe it was a recessive gene. Who knows? But we might expect it to pop up somewhere or even have a name, you know, Fatticcione syndrome or something like that. Now, if the claim is a hoax, then all we would have to explain is how people are deceived. So that might be an easier kind of route to go. So this is just, again, we're just 50,000 feet looking at what's called the reductio, and I told you I'd explain the pig. The pig is, as you can see in this case, flying. And you've heard that expression, when pigs fly. Yeah, right, when pigs fly. And the idea is, so like, suppose I'm sitting at the table with my wife, and she says something like, you should clean up the table. And I say, yeah, when pigs fly. What I mean is, yeah, that's not very likely, right? It's not very likely given what we know is true, and that's I tend to not want to clean up the table. It's actually just an example. I clean up the table all the time. But the idea is, what you're saying is so improbable on the basis of what we already know is true. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying, well, if there was magic, if this was magic, some kind of magical spell, then we should have other examples of people doing this, right? Maybe someone he learned it from, maybe someone, right? I mean, on the face of it at least, that should be the case. If it's just a question of odd physiology, do we have other examples of people being able to do this, right? Well, we should. We have billions and billions and billions of examples of people. Surely something like this would probably be detected. He detected it, right? Angelo did when he was a child. Okay, and then lastly, if this is a hoax, then the result is we would only have to explain how the people are deceived. Okay, so next principle we're going to talk about is Occam's razor. This name comes from a medieval logician named William of Occam, who actually never makes this claim. He never actually makes the claim that's named after him, but it inspires much of what he does in his, in his formal logic. It's not formal logic, it's medieval, but what it inspires his work. By the way, I'm just going to throw it out there. I would love to have some principle that people use throughout life named after me, when I don't actually have to say what the principle is. I think that would be a great gig. So if any of you have something like that lined up, let Professor Vitt know, and we can call it, Vitt's pie or something like that. Okay, Occam's razor. An old principle, we all use it, and it means basically the simplest explanation. Oops, let's skip past that. Occam's razor, it's an old claim, and we, for some reason though, this is bugging me because this slide is out of order, so we're just going to go with it. Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the best. So when I told you I could fly, the simplest explanation was, he's lying, right? Of course no one can fly, okay? But then if I present evidence of me in a photo, you say, okay, well, you're either flying or you faked that. It's more simple to just say that you faked it, it's a hoax, right? Okay, then I bring the people on board, and all these people are watching me fly, and they come back and report to you. And you would say, look, it's a more simple explanation that you somehow bamboozled all of these people than that this actually happened, right? So Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is the best. In other words, another way to think about it is, the explanation is probably going to be something that we already know exists, right? Something that is already true. So let's look at these explanations according to Occam's razor. If Angelo was actually floating by means of using magic, then we have an entirely new class of forces in the universe that we would have to classify, right? That would not be a very simple explanation, because it would require the introduction of forces involving magic and the supernatural. Okay, next point. If Fataccioni just had weird organs, right, and it was something in his DNA, then what we know about the biology of humans, and perhaps even the physics of floating, right, may be totally wrong, right? And it seems unusual that the things that we know are true in biology would be wrong. For instance, we know cells have certain components to them, and we know that these components undertake processes, right? I mean, we have some decent idea of what's going on in biology and physics. It's being added to every day, but it seems unlikely that the stuff that we know about biology and physics is wrong. Okay, so that's not a simple explanation. Lastly, if this was a hoax, then people were just fooled, right? And that would be the most simple explanation, because we know that people get fooled, and we know that people fool people. So that's the least conservative hypothesis that we can adopt. So, hoax is the most simple explanation, but that doesn't mean that it's the right one. right? So we're going to pick the most simple explanation, that this is a hoax. But it doesn't mean that we're right. And this is super important, right? When we consider whether or not a claim has met the burden of proof. So I'm going to kind of back around here. This is the last part of the framework that I want to talk about. When we look at the evidence, right, and we say, well, it's an extraordinary claim, what evidence do we have? Well, we have cotemporaneous, meaning reports that occur right when the phenomena occurs. It's not like 50 years pass and then someone publishes a biography of someone who says, hey, my uncle could float, right? No, these were newspapers. These were people on faculty at university. I mean, we have lots and lots of evidence that this appears to have occurred, right? Unfortunately, that evidence is not open to inspection anymore. We're not able to go over there and take a peek and see exactly how Angelo does this. We've looked at, we're looking at this last point, that the evidence that we have is that people were able to inspect and report Angelo's floating, right? But remember, the reports of the inspection are not the same as the inspection. Now, this comes up later because this comes up in the history of 20th century psychic research, because there's an individual by the name of Uri Geller. And Uri Geller submitted to testing from Stanford. And so these scientists at Stanford tested him, and they actually came back and said that they thought that he was psychic. When people reviewed the controls for those studies, they found that there were controls that were lacking, and that so in other words, they were experimenting on Geller, but they weren't doing it in the best way possible. And as a result, it reduces the certainty of the results. So in this case, we can't say much about what the doctors at Harvard did or what they found. So we can't really say that this evidence was open to inspection. Okay, so now we get to a critical part in the framework. Has the claim met the burden of proof? There are two options. Yes, if the claim meets the burden of truth, then the claim is established. If no, the claim may still be true, so we don't deny it, we just don't know. So, for instance, let me just very quickly point this out, and then I'll give you the answer to this with regard to Angelo floating. It may be true that Angelo had superpowers, but I don't have enough evidence to claim that that's true. Okay, now I'm going to try and explain this point in a couple different ways. I'm going to use two different examples. The general point that I'm making here about a claim being possible versus having reasons to believe it is something called Russell's teapot. And this is Bertrand Russell right here. You see him there on the pipe, taking a picture, looking like a G. Not really. Well, kind of. This is about as hardcore as a philosopher's portrait will ever get, right? Looking very sternly at the camera. And Russell had this idea. Look, suppose you ran into somebody, suppose it's Professor Vitt, and this person believes that there's a teapot which is orbiting the sun somewhere between the sun and Mars. Well, this is such a massive distance that we would never be able to actually find the teapot, right? It would just be such a small thing in such a vast space, we would never find it. So we could never actually prove or disprove the claim, right? Because we couldn't cover all that ground. So suppose I tell you I think there's this teapot, and you say, why do you think that? And I say to you, well, you can't prove that I'm wrong. You can't prove that there's not a teapot out there. Therefore, I'm entitled to believe in this teapot. And you would say, no, just because I can't prove that there's no teapot out there doesn't mean that you then have good reasons to believe that it's true, right? This is the difference between something being possible and having reasons to believe that thing. Let me give you an example from, we've got a fight. Hold on just a second. Okay, so here we go. I wanted to give you guys an example. Okay, so I want to give you guys an example of what I'm trying to explain here with regard to burden of proof. I had a friend in junior high school who actually thought that vampires were real because his grandfather had told him a bunch of very scary stories about when he was a little boy in Eastern Europe and about being chased by vampires and stuff. And at some point, I just thought it was cool. I think it would be great if vampires were real, but I didn't think they were. And I said, well, nobody really thinks vampires are real. And he says, yeah, but you can't prove that they aren't real, right? In other words, I can't go back in time. I don't have a time machine, and I can't go back to his grandfather's village in Eastern Europe, right, and investigate whether or not he was really chased by a vampire one night or whatever the story is. And so he thought that because I couldn't disprove his belief, that I was then in the clear, right? That he could just believe in vampires because nobody could prove him wrong. Well, that's not correct, right? And this is the form of his thinking here, and I've represented this as an argument, right? I mentioned that in the syllabus video. This is an example of an argument. An argument, remember, is a technical term, and it means that you have a premise, which is number one, and a conclusion. So you have a premise which supports your conclusion, supposedly, and then two, your conclusion. Now, this is not a very good argument, right? Someone claims my friend says, you can't prove vampires aren't real, so I'm entitled to believe in them. No, that's not right. Just because I can't disprove your claim doesn't mean that then the claim gets to push forward and on up, right? You'd still need to prove your claim. The onus isn't on me to disprove what you think. You're the one asserting what you think. So you're the one who needs to establish the claim. I don't need to disconfirm the claim, okay? So this is an important point. I'm going to give you a couple of examples on this, but the basic overriding principle is the burden to prove something is on the person making the claim, right? The person making the claim needs to prove it. And so the burden of proof is on that person, not on the person to whom they're communicating the claim. Okay, so let me put it this way. Suppose we go back to Angelo for a second, the human cork, right? I'm not saying that Angelo didn't have these superpowers. He very well might have. I just don't have belief on it. The positive claim hasn't been made, right? I'm lacking belief in Angelo's superhuman powers. I'm going to suspend judgment until there's positive claim, but I'm not making some active attempt to discredit it. I'm just saying there's no reason to believe it, right? It's certainly powerful. It's certainly possible that Angelo had this superpower of floating, but I just don't have enough evidence to establish it. This is an important point because sometimes people think of critical thinkers as debunkers, right? They say, "Oh, you don't believe in ghosts. You're this big debunker." Look, I'm just saying there's not enough evidence for ghosts. I'm not saying whether or not they're really real. That's up to you. That's your decision to make, right? It's not part of your grade per se. Let me give you two quick examples of this. You will find these examples in your first exam. And there'll be questions whether or not you understand what I'm about to explain. So let's take the first example here on the right of Lady Justice, right? And this is to represent a criminal trial. Suppose I'm sitting in a criminal trial with you. We're both on the jury. And this is going to be a 6-month-long trial. And on the second week, on a lunch break, you say to me, "Do you think the defendant is guilty?" Or, "Do you think the person who's on trial is guilty?" And I say, "No." And then you say, "Oh, so you think he's not guilty?" And I say, "No." And I don't know yet whether I think he's guilty or not. I'm going to wait and suspend judgment until I hear all the evidence, right? So it's not that I think he's guilty or not. I just don't think any case has been made either way yet, right? That's what I'm trying to get across with regard to something like psychics or vampires. I'm not saying there aren't psychics. I'm just saying I haven't found the evidence yet to support that claim. Does that make sense? So I'm not out debunking stuff. Far from it. I'm open to the evidence. If somebody's got that, all the more power to them. Great for them. It's a good thing. But I am more evidence-based, and so this is the sense in which, right, as a critical thinker, I would rely on the evidence rather than the possibility of the claim. Let me give you another example involving gumballs. Suppose that we have a competition going, and the competition is to guess the number of jars of gumballs in the jar. So all week long, people are making guesses. And you and I go up to the gumball. It's our day to look at the gumball and try to guess. And you say, Professor Vitt, you think that the number of gumballs in the jar is odd, right? It's an odd number. So it's, it's 135 or, an odd number, right? As opposed to an even number. And I say, no, I don't think the number of gumballs is odd. And you say, oh, so you think the number of gumballs is even. And I say, no, I don't think that either. I don't know which one it is. I'm not making the claim. I haven't seen either claim proven yet, right? So I lack belief in whether or not the gumball has an even number So I lack belief that the gumball jar has an even number of gumballs or an odd number of gumballs. I don't know either way yet. I don't have enough evidence, but I'm open to further evidence that rolls in. It's so important that on some level that you recognize this, because you have to be open to evidence in the future. If you don't keep your beliefs and your claims open to further evidence, then you shut them off from the world. But you have to keep yourself open to new evidence because things may change. You may find out more information, right? So those are two examples I would expect for you guys to look for on the exam. And again, this is just to hammer the point home. This class is not here to debunk claims. I have many students who hold paranormal claims, but they're in a better position when they realize, oh, okay, somebody may lack belief in what I'm claiming, but they're not debunking it, right? They're just saying there's not enough positive evidence yet for them to believe, right? But it's also important to realize that you could be wrong. It can be very hard to say, without exception, that there's never been a psychic, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe somebody born in Tibet once was. I mean, I don't know. But so I'll leave the possibility open for new evidence. But as of right now, I don't find the evidence. Does that make sense? That's the argument anyway. You don't have to agree with the argument. You don't have to love it or even get a tattoo of the argument. But as long as you understand it, that's what's most important. Remember, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but rather how to think. Hopefully this video hasn't been such a massacre that doesn't happen. Another point about burdens of proof. Look, I don't need to so let's suppose that my friend says, well, you need to prove that they're vampires or this proposition stands. And I say, well, no, look, there's an alternative to there being real vampires, and that alternative is maybe your dad or your grandfather as a little boy, so I'm still using the vampire example. Maybe as a little boy, your grandfather was told these stories and he since thought they happened to him, or he had nightmares and he thought they were real, right? Those would be things that we know actually happen, right? We know kids have nightmares. We know memory is really bad, and over time we can take other people's memories and believe that they're our own and so forth. It's called source amnesia. These are alternatives to the existence of vampires. I don't need to prove that my friend's grandfather was actually committing some kind of memory error or trying to commit fraud on his grandfather or anything like that, right? I don't need to prove that because my friend is making the extraordinary claim that vampires exist, but that evidence is lacking. And so because that evidence is lacking, then there are reasonable alternatives that are preferable because they're less extraordinary. So they don't really need to be proved. They don't even need to be asserted. They're just more reasonable than an extraordinary claim by default. Does that help? Okay. All right, I hope so. We'll continue to work on these processes, and if this was a nightmare or there's something in the video you don't understand, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk about it. And this is the last thing. Remember, all of our claims are subject to revision. Now, this is for the class, okay? This is the class, and the idea here is, you have to be open to new evidence if it comes along. And that's because we are imperfect in how we process information, and new information comes to light. And so we always have to be willing to change our beliefs. Otherwise, we become a thermometer that tells the wrong weather, that gives you the wrong temperature. We become a clock that's broken and only tells the time once a day, if that, right? A broken clock doesn't tell time. And unless your claims are open to revision, it doesn't mean you have to revise them. In other words, unless you're willing to change your beliefs when new evidence comes along, then you become like a broken clock that doesn't tell time, or maybe tells it once a day. Okay, that's the end of the course framework video. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. If it hasn't, I apologize. I encourage you to rely on that outline, and then if you have any further questions, email me. Okay, you guys, thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.